Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. And I know you're going to love our guest tonight. She's absolutely awesome. And she has an unbelievable, frightening tale to tell. And it's true. It's all true. So her name is Andrea Perron. And how about we welcome her?
Yes, please.
Hi, Andrea. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Norene. Oh, it's such a pleasure to be with you, truly.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm so excited. I can't stand it. I want to hear your story so bad. I was watching you. She is on YouTube. She has several channels on YouTube, and I was watching them last night, but I didn't want to hear everything because I wanted to hear everything fresh tonight because the story is so awesome. So, Andrea, can you please tell, what's the name of your book?
It's House of Darkness, House of Light, and it's volume 1 of the trilogy. Volume 2 will be out in a couple of months. Volume 3 will come out in October. And then early next year, a film which is tentatively entitled The Warren Files. It was The Conjuring. They're deciding on a title. But New Line Cinema has the project. It's in extremely capable hands. And basically what they're doing is they're telling our family story from the perspective and based on the case files of Ed and Lorraine Warren, who came in 1973 to investigate our property, our home, and what was happening in our house. And they were involved in the case for a little more than a year, I would think. And then something happened that was so horrific.
Let's start from the beginning.
Oh, sure, Donna. Yeah, you know.
I know you.
How many hours is this show?
Good, 2?
I want to start from the beginning when your parents bought this property and it was in Rhode Island.
It is in Harrisville, Rhode Island.
Okay.
It's a beautiful place. It was the old Arnold estate, and it was, at the time that we purchased the farm, it was 200 acres of land, ancient farmhouse. The land was deeded in 1680. It was one of the original Providence plantations. Roger Williams came up with that idea, the founder of the colony of Rhode Island. Because it was such a small patch of land, he figured if he didn't segment it out soon enough, so Connecticut and Massachusetts would swallow it up. So it's one of the original properties. It was originally thousands of acres, and it is a magnificent home. The house was completed as it is now in 1736, and when we moved into the house, 8 generations of one extended family had lived in that house from the time it was built, and they had lived and died in the house, and a great number of them never left.
How many died?
We found that out the hard way, starting on the day that we moved into the property in January of 1971. We purchased it at the end of 1970. My mother found it in June of 1970. And it took several months to get all of the details and the financing worked out. And then, of course, it was Christmas. And then Mr. Kenyon, the owner of the house, was very slow in leaving. He'd been there decades and decades. It was a huge, enormous undertaking. So consequently, we didn't move into the house until January of 71. And when we did, we discovered on the first day an apparition who my sister affectionately named Manny, the first day we moved in. And Nancy, Christine, and Cindy all saw this man at the house. In fact, I believe Christine asked my mother, "Who's the man that was with the Kenyons?" And she said, "What man?" There, you know, it was just Mr. Kenyon, his son, and his daughter-in-law, and that was it. And so
how many of their?
I'm sorry.
How many of there are you? There's how many sisters?
Oh. See, I just assume everybody knows all this already. I'm so sorry. I am the eldest of 5 daughters. I was 12 when we moved to the farm. My youngest sister, April, was 5. April developed a very intense, long-term friendship with a little ghost in the house. details of that relationship were not even divulged until about 4 years ago when I began writing the book. I interviewed at great length every single individual in my family and compiled huge notebooks on every recollection that everyone had, and then began the cross-referencing and cross-comparison to make sure that I chronicled it correctly. And I thought there would be many discrepancies, and in fact, when I put the whole manuscript together at close to 1,600 pages, I had to change one thing. I had to change an episode which occurred in the fall, and I had written it as if it had occurred in the spring. And that was the one change I had to make in the entire manuscript when all was said and done. Everyone in my family well recalls my parents and all of my 4 siblings. The many, many encounters that we had. They were encounters, and I use that word deliberately because we developed relationships with some of these spirits.
Now, how many sisters were there? There's 5 of you. So you were 12. April was 5. How old was Cindy, Nancy, and Christina?
Christine was the middle. Nancy was 18 months younger than me, so she was probably 10 she was 10 when we moved into the house. She turned 11 in February. And then, good Catholic family. Christine and Nancy are only 11 months apart. So she was 9, Cindy was 8, and April was 5.
Okay, got it. So, was there any brothers?
No,
just the
thank
girls.
God. We were tomboys enough. We had the whole boy thing completely covered. 200 acres of land, we were climbing trees and walking stone walls and hanging from rafters in the barn, just not by a noose like some of our predecessors had.
So your mother found this house, and your parents wanted to buy this house. Now, when they purchased this house, did they know that there were deaths in the family? Or the owners had died in the house?
No, we knew nothing, and in fact, no one suspected. We went in, all of us, all 7, including both 30-year-old adults. I think my mother was 29 when we moved to the farm. My father was 33. None of the 5 of us, of the 7 of us, other than a vision my mother once had as a child. That was the only time in her entire life she ever had any kind of a spiritual encounter. But none of us went into that house thinking that it was anything other than a very old, really cool place, unlike anything that we had ever seen. But we were all drawn to the place from the moment I start the first volume in Cumberland, Rhode Island, and it's a very important reason why. And everything that happened for about 8 months prior to my mother finding the farm, about a year before my mother found the farm, many, many things changed in our lives, and a number of instances occurred that were literally bizarre. And they all needed to be included in the story because it was this series of events which catapulted us into a situation where my mother, who was not looking for a piece of property, opened the newspaper, and she said it was if there was a light around the little boxy advertisement. And she called a realtor at 9:30 at night. My mother is not rude. And that's too late to call. And she did anyway. And she made an appointment the next morning to see the farm and emptied the family bank account, put $500 down on it. And my father was out of town and had no idea that this was happening.
When you moved into the house, did anybody feel anything? Did you feel uncomfortable in any way?
Well, we did, and we felt, it's hard to describe, and some people may even question it, but I will truly tell you that every one of us in our own private way experienced the the sensation of being enveloped by the pallor of death. And it wasn't that we were, seeing a full body solid apparition the first day that you move into a property, that's reason enough to skew your thinking. Nancy didn't tell Christine, didn't tell Cindy. Nobody talked about these things that were happening. They began immediately, and nobody talked about them to anyone except me for the first 4 or 5 months, at which point the reports from my siblings to me in the middle of the night as they piled into my bed to sleep with me led me to the point where I knew that I had to disclose everything to my mother. And I believe it was in May or early June of the first year that we lived there that everything came to light. But keep in mind, by that time, one of our neighbors and all of us had seen my mother severely beaten with a heavy coat hanger in a closet in the house. My mother had been attacked by a scythe in the barn. She had opened the fireplace for some sense of warmth in a house that was otherwise ice cold all the time. It was almost an unlivable situation. None of us had any clue that we would be moving into a 250-year-old farmhouse that was just clapboard with no insulation whatsoever, and that we would be freezing to death. And then you couple that with the fact that when there was an entity in the room with you, the temperature would plummet to a point where you could literally see your breath in the house, but only in the space where this was occurring. And we would call that sensation, Cindy called it, and then we all began to call it being in the bubble, where virtually everything outside of the space that you're sharing with this being, this spirit, is closed off to what is actually happening to you in that moment. Time is altered. In fact, it ceases to exist.
Did you ask your parents if you could move? If you guys could just leave the house at that time?
Well, none of us wanted to leave the farm. We were all in love with it, and we all felt very, very drawn to it. And when the Warrens came into the picture about 3 years into the 10 that we spent at the farm, one of the reasons that April would not disclose her experiences to the Warrens was because she didn't want them to take her friend away, and she thought that they had the power to do that.
So you were there 3 years when the Warrens were called in? What was the circumstances that made you call the Warrens in?
We didn't, but a friend of my mother's, Barbara, had seen them speak at Rhode Island College or at URI. I can't remember. I'll have to check on that. But one of the 2 major universities in Rhode Island, and out of many. And she went to my mother and said, my mom had shared some things with her, and she said maybe they can help you. And then she went to see them. No, first she saw them in Putnam, Connecticut, and she asked my mom about it, if she wanted her to mention to them about our situation. And my mother told her it would be all right to do that, and she did. And they came to see us. Another group came first. Pyro, I believe they came first. We're not sure. Nobody remembers exactly. Within a close period of time, a group from Rhode Island College that was headed by a young woman and a friend of mine, Keith Johnson, came and tried to help and at least get a sense of what was going on at the place. But really, they were not much older than we were. They were youngsters. And even though my mother felt an instant affinity, particularly with Keith Johnson, he seemed like such a true and pure spirit, which I can attest to the fact that he is. And he really wanted to help, and she was very open with him and discussed many things. And Keith came back and had a number of experiences at the farm. But the Warrens also came in that same time frame. And unbeknownst to us, the Warrens knew the group, the Pyro group, including Keith. And they were somehow mutually sharing information that they knew, or folklore or stories or whatever they knew of the farm. But the Warrens, my mother took them very seriously. They were older. They obviously had quite a track record of cases already in their career. And it didn't take long for her to figure out that if there was anybody that could help us, that perhaps it would be them. And she shared a great deal of information and got very close with Lorraine Warren. Ed Warren, who has sadly passed away, we all recall him as just a huggy bear, just the most gentle, wonderful, warm creature. I mean, just an amazing man. And he felt very protective toward us. You know, we were just 5 little girls that he felt were vulnerable and susceptible to what was going on in the house, and he was absolutely right about that. But when you grow up, even at 12 years old, coming into this new environment that felt so familiar to me in ways I cannot, even at 53 years old, I cannot express to you how familiar the place felt. And it was years before I realized why. But we all had the same reaction. We were drawn to it. It was a familial connection to the farm. And to this day, we cannot, through any line of genealogy, we cannot determine where or how there was even conceivably a connection between us now and us, or any of us at an earlier time, and which prompts, of course, the whole notion of reincarnation. We don't know. The only thing that I can tell you, Norene, Donna, the only thing that I can tell both of you is that I know there is something beyond our mortal existence, and that we, human beings, are essentially spiritual beings, and we are having this experience. We are in this form now. I came home from college in 1976 in October over the Columbus holiday weekend, which coincides with my birthday. And my father flew me home after I whined incessantly for 6 weeks that I was miserable being away from my home and my family. And I hadn't eaten on the plane, so my family was eating dinner. I stood in front of the fireplace. I was so cold. I remember it felt like the whole right side of my body literally could not move. It was frozen solid, just the right sheath, the side of my shoulder, down the side of my thigh to my ankle, which almost hurt. It was so cold. And my father, who was sitting in the dining room adjacent to the parlor I was in, looked up at me, dropped his fork, and he said, "You have company. Somebody's here to welcome you home." And all that I could turn was my head. The rest of my body was unable to move. But I turned my head and I looked directly into my own eyes and recognized instantly my own features, as if I were gazing into a mirror image, a reflection of myself, only it was from at least 200 years prior, and the garb was 17th century garb. And I knew. That was when I knew. And I didn't tell anybody in my family about that for 30 years because I didn't want them to do what I did, which was to extrapolate the possibility that we all lived in that house in a prior life and may go back. I wrote this book for a lot of reasons. I wrote it as a gift to the world, truly. It exposes the fourth dimension in ways that I don't think have ever been addressed in any forum prior to now. A quantum physicist who's a friend of mine said it's the quantum leap, and 1980. And we did it with good reason because we weren't prepared. to exhume the dead, and when we did, they were buried remarkably close to the surface. I say that with purpose and reason and intent because there are some things that you never forget, that you remember every single detail of, that you remember the smell of, the visceral sense of, the sensation of being in the experience in that moment, in a moment that is literally frozen in time.
So
And
Andrea,
it is,
would you say? Well, I just want to ask you a question. Would you say then, because of your experience at your house, that this is proof to you that there is life after death?
yes.
Did
Yes,
you?
and I've lived my whole life from the age of 12 knowing it. So I've been freed virtually my entire life from any fear of death because based on what we experienced in the house, it formed my spiritual foundation. And I know that if I live my life well and I live in good faith and I'm true to myself, and some people might disagree with me, but I've come to the conclusion that it is not wise to take your own life because several of the people who live on, as it were, at the farmhouse even now, committed suicide. And if you really are into the paranormal and you've done a lot of research, you find frequently that people that have committed suicide are unable to cross over into another realm, that they are held back either by the trauma of the event. We had several ghosts which we believed. We identified one, Prudence Arnold, 11 years old, raped and murdered at the farm, still there, doesn't know she's dead.
But it's because of the trauma. Do you then think that my belief, and I've been dealing with ghosts my whole life, just from being sensitive and you know, just kind of this gift that was given to me, that I find that many spirits who have committed suicide, they're there because their mind tells them, if I go forward, I'm going to hell. So they still hold on to those human thoughts that they have, that they had in life and that they were taught. But that necessarily doesn't mean when you die and cross over that you're going to hell.
Good question.
So do you believe it's that they still have the human thought process? That they still believe in those traumas that happened and what they learned in life, but if they were to let that go, they could then move on and learn their lessons.
I think that that's just as plausible an explanation as anything else. I think that there are some things that we will never know, and that perhaps we're not supposed to know, but that we are absolutely, as thinking, feeling human beings, allowed to speculate about what we've experienced, what you and I have both come to terms with in our own personal way in our lifetimes. And it is a gift. It truly is. I absolutely consider the decade that I spent living at the farm to be the best decade of my life because it taught me what I needed to know to conduct my life well.
Andrea, I have a question from one of the viewers. It's Janet Russell, and she is a psychic medium, and she is asking. She says I keep feeling UFO intervention with her family. I could be wrong, but it's very strong. Has anyone had a sighting while living there?
I can't believe somebody asked me that question. That is the first time, and I've done, I don't know how many interviews that I've been asked that question. And I almost prayed that no one ever did, because I did not want to intermingle the complexities of this story with other experiences that we had at the farm. I did not want to be perceived as I wanted this story to be taken as seriously as possible, and I did not think that I would find as many believers in UFOs as I found in the paranormal community, a community that I did not know existed until 4 years ago. When we walked away from the farm, we walked away from everything spooky. And even though we've all been surrounded by our guides and had experiences in the decades since, it wasn't something that we really shared, and it was very personal. But I think every single one of us saw something beyond bizarre that came from the sky at the farm.
So,
Yes.
so you're saying you did have a UFO experience?
Yes, and since then.
Oh man.
Yes,
Woo.
and it's not written anywhere. And talk about the scoop of the millennium. You just got it.
Well,
Because
Janet,
we haven't discussed it with anyone.
I've got chills so bad. Janet Russell is saying that she is an abductee, and that is why she's asking. And that is what happened to her, she said, and those were her experiences.
It's, I do not discount anything, and I listen with deep respect to everyone's point of view. I've never had anybody approach me and say, I'm not really interested, I don't believe in ghosts. Not once in all the shows and book signings and appearances that I've made, not once has someone said, I'm really a skeptic. You know, people that gravitate to me are believers. And the book was not written to turn anyone into a believer. It was written as an authentic chronicle of events, as a collective memoir from my entire family, and I wrote it, compiled it, and wrote it. But each one of us has had intense experiences where we have seen things that are not of this world. And it wasn't just at the farm, but it began at the farm.
Well, you talked a little bit, maybe we could go into how often did these experiences happen at the farm? Was it a daily occurrence? And then also you talked about your mother being attacked. I'm just kind of amazed. I hear stories of people who are attacked. A friend of mine actually was attacked on a nightly basis, and he lived through it. And why would you stay in a place for 10 years? And it sounds like people were attacked. Your family was attacked.
It is, truer words were never spoken. It's a long story.
Yeah.
We moved in, think back in history to 1969, 70, and 71. Our country was in great turmoil. We just apparently came through one of the worst economic disasters in this country's history. But that time was compared in many respects, great abuse of power that extended all the way to the presidency with Richard Nixon. You know, it was a very, very difficult time. The crisis that we just went through didn't make itself, and neither did the one that preceded it by 30 years. And as soon as we bought the farm, it began to devalue. As soon as my parents scraped together every dime they could get their hands on and borrowed money from family members and sold the boat and sold everything that we could sell to get the down payment together to make this impossible thing happen. It was truly the impossible dream. It shouldn't have happened. Everything had to conspire, and there was a confluence of events which occurred that caused us to get the farm, as though there were puzzle pieces dropping from the sky and landing on the table in perfect formation and interlocking with each other. It all had to happen exactly, precisely the way that it did for us to get the farm. There was a huge emotional and financial investment made by every member of our family, including my youngest sister, April. And as uncomfortable as it was, and as unfamiliar as it was, it also felt like it was exactly where we belonged. It was our right and proper place in the world, and we loved it. We loved every square inch of it, and we still do. There are members of my family who will never ever step back on that property, and there are members of my family who would buy it back in a heartbeat, and everything in between. I go back frequently. I'm friends with the people who own it, but there was a huge emotional attachment when my mother realized that they had bought a haunted house. She wanted to sell the house. My father, at that point, who had insisted we couldn't ever pull it together to get the place, then said that its worth was dropping on a month-by-month basis, and that we'd go bankrupt, we'd lose everything as a family if we sold the farm. And he didn't believe what she was telling him. Now, if you knew my mother, you would understand what an incredible insult that was. My mother had never lied to my father. She was devoted to my father. She was the perfect wife and mother, and I mean, really as close as it comes. And he had no reason to doubt her veracity when she began reporting her encounters. And because he owned his own business and had to be away from home frequently and be out on the road doing business, he didn't start having any serious experiences of his own until months and months after we moved into the house. So his questioning her after, and his children, who all saw what we saw and then later disclosed, created a breach, a rift in the family. It was like there was mom and us, and then there was dad. Mm-hmm. Because dad was now on the outside, because dad didn't believe us. And the one that we needed to protect us and the one that we needed to be there for us wasn't. And it wasn't that he did it deliberately. He was afraid. He was supposed to be the one in control. He was supposed to be the head of household. And my mother, who tried to assume the position of mistress of the house, was usurped by a spirit who presumed that she still held that position hundreds of years after her death. And she had a hatred for my mother that manifested on a number of occasions. But it was really, we couldn't leave. I know that must sound, we couldn't leave. Right. We left when we were supposed to.
Right. Oh my goodness. Just to think, it's so hard to fathom, but yet I understand where you're coming from and the love of the place, and just you didn't have a choice. You had to stay there. You wanted to stay there. Your heart was there. The whole family's heart. And I think that's the amazing part is I haven't heard of another case or I've dealt with families, but I've never heard of a case where the whole family, and there were 7 of you, that they all felt drawn to this place. That's amazing.
Well, I think that as I started to say before and then got off track, which I do, you sometimes have to rein me in, just a heads up on that. What I wanted to say earlier was that I wrote the book for a lot of different reasons. I wrote it to a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. I wrote it as an honorary decree that my family has overcome and survived something that was at times horrific. But I also wrote it selfishly too, that I knew that the time had come, and I did not, and I do not want to spend eternity in that household. I don't. If that was me, my sister, there is a little girl that walks through the house crying for her mommy. My sister, Cindy, saw her frequently and said she looks just like you when you were that age, just like you. Oh my goodness. And then I see this old woman who has my watery blue eyes staring into my own. And how many times have I been there, for God's sake? Oh, I don't want to go back. And if this acknowledgement of those spirits is what releases me from being captive in that house for eternity, It was well worth the 3 solid years, 12 hours a day or more
I have a
to write it.
I have a question. Joey, one of the viewers, he's saying if it was so enjoyable or accepted, why the little house of darkness? What dark things happened there? But before we get into that, because I know this is what the book was about and why Lorraine and Ed Warren were there. But I want to ask you a question first. Okay, so all of you, even including your mother and your father, I know your mother was harmed by a spirit, but did your father and all of you see the spirits in the house?
Yes,
You all, was it the same one or did you each see a different one?
we all saw numerous spirits in the house on a relatively regular basis.
Did you communicate with them?
Yes, sometimes.
You talked to them and they spoke back to you?
Yes.
How many spirits were that you know of were in the house or on the property?
I would say a conservative estimate would be 12.
Okay. So this goes beyond, because you just spoke about the little girl and the woman and the recognition of the face and the eyes. This is beyond haunting. This has to do with,
It's a portal disguised as a farmhouse.
wow. So is, some theories and some in the paranormal community are that there were lives going on, at the same time. Is that
Yes.
what this is?
I don't know.
Wow.
If I did, I think I would be crowned queen of the universe.
You
because
would.
I think the eternal questions that we all ask ourselves in the wee hours, if we are thinking, feeling human beings, we do. We want to know about our own mortality, and we don't want to just think that it's ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I wish that I knew. I will tell you, this is an amalgamation of empirical evidence, of evidence, eyewitness evidence. Many people, not just us, but many people who were there with us had experiences at the house. A very large number of people who were friends of ours who visited us at the house and had experiences died premature deaths.
Oh my goodness.
Wow.
From different.
There are, which is why I'm so grateful to this day that we're all still alive and kicking. Because the same blue light that hit my mother's friend Fran, that came down and turned at a 90-degree angle out of our fireplace and hit her, also went through the center of my mother and came through us sitting in front of the fireplace. It happened several times. And that light, that beam of light, there's no telling. I mean, there's no way of knowing. All we know is that Fran died decades earlier than she should have. And so did a number of other people who were friends of ours and visited with us frequently at the farm. So I'm grateful that we all survived the experience and whatever it was that was going on there and that currently is going on there. The owners that have it now lived there for 24 years. They have many experiences of their own to share. In fact, when I'm all done with these 3 books, my next project is to write their story from the last quarter century of living in the farm. They're wonderful people. They moved in knowing that house was haunted. They moved in really with hat in hand, tail between legs, just, okay, we're the caretakers of this property. That was their whole approach. They were both believers, and they said, we're the caretakers here. We can all get along. Everything will be fine. We just, we love it, and we belong here, and so do you. And going in with that attitude and the notion that they would be sharing this household with those who had come before was a far cry. We went in truly as ignorant as children, all of us, including my parents. I mean, just had no idea what we were walking into. And yet it's amazing how kids are so stupid and do really stupid things, but kids are also inherently intelligent. And all of us knew we were seeing something we had never seen before in our lives for whatever the period of time that each one of us individually had been alive. None of us had seen anything like this before.
Now, Andrea, was there any, Janet Russell, again, the psychic medium, was asking about Native Americans and that there was something buried there. Now, I did see one of your videos that your mother knew about a grave that was buried nearby the house.
Yes.
And what was that grave?
Well, my mother is Native American Cherokee, and she has always had a deep and abiding belief in her ancestors, you know, but once we moved to the farm, she started doing research about the property, not only because she wanted to know its vast history, but she wanted to identify what she was seeing in the house. The pragmatic Virgo that she is, you know, her brain was going 90 miles an hour. What is this? This isn't just some phantom passing through. Whoever this is in this house is somehow attached to it with reason. And so she started really delving into the history. And my sister April was playing in the back pine grove on the property on a number of occasions and saw little Nipmuc Indian children playing in the pine grove. Now, consider that these were children that had lived hundreds and hundreds of years before we were there, but they were playing among trees that were currently there. That's the tearing. That's the crossover. They did not notice her. They did not see her. They did not respond to her. But they were playing in a pine forest that did not exist during their lifetimes. I got off track again. I'm so sorry. That happens to me frequently.
We're processing what you just said.
So what were all these events that made you call in Ed and Lorraine Warren?
Or your friend actually called.
Yeah.
Yeah. There were a number of reasons. By the time the Warrens became involved with our case and began to interview us as a family, some really intense and serious things had occurred that required intervention, or we were going to have to just leave. That was the way my mother felt about it, just pack and leave. But my father, you know, and he didn't want any part of it. He didn't want anything to do with psychic investigators. He considered them charlatans. He considered demonology a made-up profession. And Ed was a real demonologist. Ed was trained in the Catholic Church, from deep within the Catholic Church. Really only one of a handful of legitimate demonologists in the world. And the truth is, we had benign spirits in the house for the most part, but one that was truly malignant, and yet there was something else. There was an evil presence in that house that was something separate and distinct from the individual spirits that we came to know in the house. And that's what they inadvertently released.
The Warrens, as you know, and the paranormal community is very divided on the Warrens.
Yes,
They are either loved or they're either hated and are called fake. So could you talk a little bit more about the relationship with the Warrens and what was it that they did for you and your family?
We all believe that they came to us with pure spirit, that they came to us to help us. And I just refuse to believe anything else. I think that they were unprepared for what they faced in our house. Ed, on his deathbed, and I have this from a really reliable source, asked his wife Lorraine if she would spend the rest of her life making sure that some way, somehow, that their experience with the Perron family was told to the world. Because at that point he figured, decades had gone by and we'd made no movement to share our story with anyone. And he said that they both always maintained that it was the most significant and the most compelling and disturbing of the thousands of investigations that they conducted over 50 years. And love them or hate them, question them or have faith in them, it doesn't matter, because we had a personal experience with them and a personal relationship with them, which was in some ways very disappointing and upsetting, and in other ways a real kinship evolved, a real affection, especially for Ed. And so we have our personal experience, but the fact is that they are in many respects the founders of what is now a worldwide, millions of members community of people who are investigating themselves, and one image at a time, one EVP at a time, one capture at a time, are validating everything that they said existed 50 plus years ago when nobody talked about, I have a ghost in my house. Right. We found out the hard way, just by being little kids that went to school and said, oh my, you just won't believe what happened in our house last night. And it took just a few incidents of sharing with our friends for it to be all over the school. I mean, we were shunned. We were, a lot of people, we went through hell, the five of us, and learned very quickly to shut up. It was not something that we could share. And it took the world society maturing to the extent that a significant portion of the world population has either had a spiritual experience or believes of the potential and the possibility that it exists. And that's why we waited as long as we did. This is the right time. The world is at a, there's many changes going on right now. 2012 is a very important year, and not because the Mayans said that it's the end of time. In many respects, it's the beginning of the new age.
Right.
And a lot of this book is a part of it. This story is a part of that. And all the work of all the people who are out there seriously addressing the issue of our immortality. We are mortal now, but we are all immortal beings. It really is the quantum leap. I do a speech that I give called The Biggest Chill, play on words of The Big Chill, where, this group of people, they're all peers, have to confront their mortality because one of their friends has died by his own hand.
Right.
And I take it that quantum leap to the fourth dimension. The biggest chill is coming to terms with our immortality. It's almost easier, really, in the grand scheme of things, to believe that when you die, you sleep, that's it, it's over, than to add all the other complicating factors that are revealed in the course of this story, and our experiences in that house. My mother often says, I'd rather just go have the eternal sleep and have there be nothing than to even face the potential of living another lifetime in that house. I don't want to go back, and I feel the same way.
Andrea, so when Ed and Lorraine Warren came to the house, what did they exactly do when they were there?
Well, they came, I think, a grand total of about 6 times that they spent time at the house. It began with interviews, long chat sessions between Lorraine and my mother. Ed would spend time with us. My father tried to just function on the periphery if he was there at all, but later got to know Ed and kind of developed at least a mutual respect. And then my parents, they tried to tape us, excuse me. Oh, it's time for a little red lemonade.
Yay.
They tried to tape us and photograph us, and we were told that on several occasions, nothing came out on the tape or the audio. I don't know if that's absolutely true or not. They didn't share anything with us that they had recorded or photographed. We never saw any photographs that they had taken, but they had something, because my parents went out to their home in Connecticut once, at Lorraine's suggestion, because she said, I can't get anything of you in the house itself, it stops it. And it always did. I mean, my attorney went there a few years ago, and with a brand new camcorder, couldn't record a thing, or camera wouldn't work, or cell phone wouldn't work, nothing worked while she was there, because they suck all the energy out of every battery item, every human being, that if they're trying to manifest, or if they're making their presence known, they drain the energy out of everything. So, she was very frustrated. It's just like, this place is magical, and I don't even, nothing, I can't, nothing. But it happens. But the fact is that when my mother and father went to Connecticut, they were able to capture some audio, and I've heard it, and it is truly haunting, and I suspect that some use of it will be made in the film. But they came 5 to 6, 7 times, spent hours there. The next to the last time that we ever saw them at the farm was the night that they came and pretty much insisted that things were escalating to such an extent that it was time to identify and to attempt to dispel what was haunting my mother in particular, that was tormenting my mother.
So did they seem to think that these were evil spirits that were in the house?
Mrs. Warren always called the spirit Bathsheba. She said that she psychically intuited that the name of the woman that was causing so much distress was named Bathsheba, and there was a woman that lived there who was an Arnold, and married Judson Sherman, Bathsheba Sherman. But she was of the Arnold and the Thayers, and was associated with that farm. And she died in 1885, but when she was a very young woman, probably late teens, an infant was left in her care, and the baby died from convulsions, and it was later discovered that a needle had been impaled at the base of its skull, and she was accused of practicing witchcraft and killing the child. It never reached a point of acquittal. There was not enough evidence to convict her or even to try her, but even though she could not, there was an inquest, and the judge let her off the hook, because he had no reason to hold her, because there was no evidence at all that she had done anything malicious to the child. There was no DNA or anything, of course.
Right.
And the people in the town, though, convicted her in the public square, so to speak. She lived a long and increasingly bitter life, totally dejected by her own community. Women hated her. She was a ravishingly beautiful woman who supposedly sold her soul to the devil for eternal youth and beauty. And when the deal fell through, she aged rapidly and died of what they, in the death certificate, wrote as paralysis. doctor that examined her said her body had literally turned to stone.
Oh my God.
Wow.
It was, yeah, she's a compelling figure.
Is she buried on? Is she buried near the property?
She's, well, that's a complicated issue because, let me put it to you this way, her headstone is next to Judson Sherman and 3 little children that she lost before the age of 4. Each one of them died before the age of 4.
So she basically
The
killed
whole
them.
family is buried at the Riverside Cemetery in downtown Harrisville. But there was always talk in town that the church would not allow her to be buried in hallowed ground, and that her family took her body back to her old home place, and that she's buried somewhere on the property.
Now, Andrea, you had mentioned something about a seance that had gone wrong. What happened? And who did the seance?
Ed and Lorraine Warren were there. There was a priest there, a medium named Mary, Pastorella, I believe was her last name. I don't know if she's still alive or not. The priest was a very tall man. He'd written a book about life after death, but we can't remember his name either. But it was not, let me be very clear on this, it was not an exorcism. My mother, sitting down at that table that night, was not a possessed woman. However, we do believe that she was an oppressed woman. She had changed radically in the first 3 years that we lived there. She went from young, almost incredibly youthful woman to someone who appeared much older than she was. Began to dress differently, began to speak differently, would use archaic language like yeoman to mention a man that she had seen in town, or and we thought at first that it was because she spent so many hours buried in history books in the archives trying to piece and patch together the whole genealogical history of the farm, and that she was just getting caught up in it. But later, we all came to believe that the mistress of the house, if she could not dispel my mother and make her leave and claim the house for herself again, and she would claim my mother from within, and she had a dramatic impact on my mother's life for a pretty extended period of time.
So I just want to be clear, was she influencing your mother then? It wasn't so much she took over her body, but she was influencing everything about her.
Not everything about her.
Okay.
But our mother changed. We didn't get her back for a period of time. And it was a gradual change. It certainly didn't happen overnight, but I mean, we were very young children and still had the presence of mind at, 12, 10, 9, 8, 5 to know that something wasn't right with mom, and maybe we shouldn't talk about our problems with her. Oh, let's go tell Andrea. She'll listen to us. They knew. I knew not to tell her. They knew not to tell her. The only one that they could tell was me. And then I had to tell her. It got to a point of critical mass where she needed to know what was happening to all of us in the house. And that's when we began to discover what was happening to her.
I still want to know what happened at the seance.
Well,
the same.
Volume 2 is coming out in like 2 months.
You mean you're not going to tell us? Oh, no. Come on. Spill the beans. What happened at the seance?
I will tell you one thing. Not to be over dramatic, I am telling you point blank, if your eyes were there, I'd stare right into them. That was the most terrifying night of my life, and I thought I watched my mother die.
Oh my goodness.
And then the Warrens were summarily dismissed from the house in very unpleasant terms by my father once my mother regained consciousness.
So he blamed them for what happened to your mother?
Absolutely.
And were you in agreement with that? I know it was a long time ago, but did you feel he...
I was 15 years old. None of us were supposed to be home. Two of my sisters went for overnights with friends. My little sister April was there, Cindy was there, I was there. We were all told to go upstairs to the upper level of the house. While the visit with the Warrens occurred, we did not know what was going to happen. My parents did not know what was going to happen when they arrived. And when they arrived, and they had an entourage. My father got very upset. He's like, oh, here we go again, and here they're coming in with all these people and photographers and, tapes, and we've got, here we go again. What is it with these people? And that is when they posed what they considered to be an imperative that a seance occur in the house that night. And my mother at that point was practically despondent. My father told all three of us to go upstairs. Nancy and Cindy would overnight with their girlfriends. And of course we disobeyed him. As a matter of course we disobeyed him. We came downstairs, Cindy and I came downstairs. I insisted that April stay upstairs. Meanwhile, she went around and came down the other staircase. I mean, this house was long and it's just a huge house, and there were two sets of stairs going up. So April snuck down toward the end of things and saw some things that she shouldn't have seen either. They unleashed an unholy presence in the house. They did. They asked it to come. They opened the door.
Oh my goodness. And was that the last time that you saw the Warrens?
No, they came to make amends one time after that incident. And my mother wouldn't let them into the house. She was as cordial as she could muster. But Mrs. Warren had borrowed a lot of her notes and her research and her personal recollections and things in a large notebook from her, and had yet to return it. Even though she had said she'd have it back before that, she had still yet to return it. And so my mother was being as pleasant as she could be, because she wanted to get her things back, and she thought that that was her last option for getting her belongings back. But the Warrens left that night, and we never saw them again. And Mrs. Warren, my mother's materials became part of the Warren files.
Oh my goodness.
So what did your dad do for a living?
Which decade?
During this time?
During that
The set from 1970 to 1980 when you were in the house.
Because he was traveling a lot.
Oh,
Yeah, my father reinvents himself. He's a brilliant, brilliant man in many respects. And he, at the time that my mother found the house, he worked for the Fuller Food Service in Mansfield, Massachusetts. But he also had a jewelry business that he was building on the side, which became so successful that he was later able to lead Fuller Foods and selling freezers and refrigerators and meats to being a salesman. And he had well-established accounts all over the eastern third of the United States, really. And so he was on the road pretty frequently. My mom and dad had a wonderful store prior to us buying the farm in downtown Pawtucket, Rhode Island, just outside of Providence. And just a great shop, just rubies, late 60s. It was great. Trust me when I won't go into any details, but black lights and posters and record albums, and it was great.
My husband is from... My husband
It was a
is...
head shop, okay.
Oh!
My parents owned a head shop, okay, now you know, all right? That's your second scoop of the night.
Fantastic. My husband's from Pawtucket. I wonder if he remembers it.
I wonder. It was right down across from, oh God, there was this great little lime Ricky shop right across the street from it. But right down in the center of downtown Pawtucket. And so he made a lot of contacts over the years that they had of Auntie. And so he built his business, and consequently he was gone a lot. Then he opened up a line of women's clothing. He and my mother ran. Then he opened up a department store. I mean, he was a real go-getter. He was always doing. But in the 10 years, and always very successful, but in the 10 years that we lived at the farm, I mean, it was just one failure after another, one horrible thing after another that happened. In terms of business propositions and the possibility for growth, it was like the house was keeping us there by giving us just enough money to eke out a living. It was feast or famine, you know. We'd have a really great trip and we'd catch up on everything, and then there was another period of time that things didn't go right. He, had this fabulous line of clothes and a great designer, and he and Mom built this. My mother's a wonderful clothing designer, very talented, and a gardener too, incredible landscape architect. And so the pipes burst, and they didn't have enough insurance money, and they lost like everything because the pipes burst in the old Stillwater Mills in downtown Harrisville. I mean, it was just one thing after another. It was like a conspiracy to keep us at the farm. And it wasn't until the last summer, no, it was during the last year, I was in college, that we lived there, and my mother called me, and she said, honey, we're putting the farm on the market. I was in my dorm room. I thought I was going to faint. I couldn't believe that something that I had heard threatened for 10 years was actually going to happen. And then when they sold the property to the abutting landowner in Massachusetts, we had 60 acres in Massachusetts, I was devastated. Several of us were devastated. Nancy really never did get over it. Because that was our house. That was our farm, and those were our spirits, and we grew up with them. And so when you get to a point where you accept the fact that spirit exists and make peace with that notion and come to terms with it and are comfortable enough to continue living there, my mother approached my father, and she said to him about 6 months before they sold the farm, she said, Roger, if I have to spend another winter in this house, it would kill me. And he believed her. Finally, he believed something that she said about this condition that our family had been in for